It's great to be with you on this edition of the India Development Debate. We really kickstart our budget programming with a big exercise right around the corner. The fiscal math doesn't seem to be adding up. On Friday, Itina put out an exclusive report on how the Modi government is staring at a revenue shortfall of over 1.5 lakh crore rupees, which could force it to roll over subsidies worth about 60,000 crore rupees to the next financial year. We also understand that the government may set the fiscal deficit target for fiscal year 20 at 3.3%, a 30 basis points breach from the FRBM target. Top-level government sources do tell your channel that a big hike in government expenditure is unlikely thanks to fiscal constraints. In fact, the government is in a catch-22 situation of sorts with the elections round the corner. Although the coffers are empty, farm sops are almost a given considering the electoral setbacks the ruling party suffered in the Hindi heartland. Add to that the fact that the Congress party has announced a minimum income guarantee scheme, and how is that going to alter and evoke reactions from the other side? Income tax sops to the middle class, the main vote bank of the BJP, is also very much being spoken about, and so we put the spotlight on the fiscal arithmetic of the Modi Sarkar. William Foster, VP Sovereign Risk Group Moody's Investor Services, joins us right here. So does R. Gopala, former Secretary of Finance in the Government of India. V. Anant Nageshwaran, Dean IFMR Business School, Kriya University, and of course Maithili Bhusnurmat, our consulting editor at ET Now. So thank you very, very much, all of you, for being with us. And William, I think your call on what happens soon after the budget is going to be very crucial. And, you know, the only question that I want to ask you is, and the finance minister was on record to say that the markets and investors and you know, ratings agencies like yourselves will be able to differentiate between what is a populist move and what is a rational move. Do you believe a breach on the fiscal front, some amount of fiscal slippage, is understandable, or is it a strict no-no?
Well, adhering to the fiscal consolidation objectives is obviously quite important from our perspective. But what's also very important is the composition of how deficits are reduced, how the spending is contributing to the economy, to what extent it's contributing to the formation of a capital base that will contribute sustainably to future GDP growth, or whether it's achieved through measures that are temporary, not sustainable or durable. So it really will depend on the details, to what extent if there is a slippage from the target of 3.3% of GDP for the central government, how much and what the drivers are for that slippage, because obviously what's important is both reducing those deficits over time, as well as contributing to growth that's sustainable, which in and of itself, higher nominal GDP growth would contribute to lower deficits and to a lower debt to GDP ratio over time. So that could be positive from a fiscal perspective, but it'll depend on the details.
No, fair point indeed. I think we will await the details. Anant Nageshwaran, let me quickly come to you before I go across to Maithili Bhusnurmat and of course Mr. R. Gopal. And Anant, in an election year where the government has got some amount of serious drubbing in the state assembly elections of the Hindi heartland, there is widespread speculation now that there will be an agri-relief package that's going to entail a large cost, not supposed to be a temporary measure like William was referring to there. And I'm presuming there will be added pressure to now respond to the whole minimum income guarantee scheme that has been offered as a poll sop by the Congress party. Given these realities, how concerned are you on the fiscal front?
Honestly, I think these are all in the realm of speculation. I think in a sense, Mr. Rahul Gandhi's promise of a minimum income guarantee also confirms that in India, Congress party has always been the one that has damaged the fiscal arithmetic. We saw that in 1980s, we saw that in 2007 until 2014, and it has always been left to the non-Congress governments to repair the fiscal as well as the and restore macroeconomic stability. And this government has done that. So I don't really see them sacrificing it too much, because the impact of any measure that they announce would probably take longer than 3 months to pay off. And populist measures haven't really guaranteed victories, whether it was in Rajasthan in 2013. Ashok Gehlot government promised a lot but could not avoid a drubbing at the time, nor has it worked in states like Tamil Nadu, where both parties have competed to announce populist measures. So I don't expect that the government would massively damage the macroeconomic stability. 20 to 30 basis points of slippage here and there shouldn't be a big concern, and I don't think that would necessarily spoil their copybook. So that is what I expect, but nothing very significantly damaging to fiscal arithmetic or fiscal prudence.
R. Gopalan, is crowd pleasing going to be the go-to sort of an option as far as this election year is concerned? Or do you believe the government that has so far shown fiscal restraint in more ways than one going to stick to that? Because election years tend to tempt governments to make wrong decisions.
Yeah, okay. See, this government, in a manner of speaking, has always been looking at fiscal prudence as something which is very crucial and important, and rightly so. As Anant Nageshwaran also mentioned, the record of this government, whether the NDA won or now, has always been decent, and they have laid the foundation for a good takeoff of the economy. The important thing is that, I mean, some of these things which are necessary for the farmers' income improvement, the schemes which are being talked of in the public realm at this point in time, we really need to tackle the farm distress at this point in time, and therefore certain announcements which are expected in the budget to ensure that the farm distress is kind of, I mean, addressed, will be very, very important. As far as the other issues in the budget are concerned, I really can't say at this point in time, except that the numbers, we'll have to look at them very carefully because of postponement of the expenditures to the next year and those other things which are which can be, I mean, done. That we'll have to look at when the numbers are really coming out. But this government, as far as I am concerned, has been fiscally prudent. I think they will continue to do so.
Okay, Maithili Bhusnurmat, I will come to you, and I think one of the questions that I want to ask you is, if you look at numbers, as numbers are right now, the fiscal deficit and the current fiscal has already crossed 114%. You still think the government will be able to maintain the fiscal deficit targets?
Well, quite possibly, Supriya, because this is only in the halfway through the year, as it were. These numbers are till November, and the comparable number for the previous year was 112%. But if you look at the revenue deficit and the primary deficit, the performance is much better than the previous year. So clearly, by the end of the year, the figures could change, and change quite dramatically. Remember, we still have the data for another 4 months to go, and we still have where the means of, as Mr. Gopalan mentioned, you can postpone expenditure because the government's budget is drawn up on a cash basis. So whereas if you draw it up on an accrual basis, the picture could be quite different. And given the fact that this government has set great store by the fact that it has been always fiscally prudent, and the track record, frankly, of this government has been fairly good, I do think that they would stick to that 3.3, if at all slip by a few basis points, maybe instead of 3.3 end up at 3.5. And remember, last year instead of 3.2 they ended up at 3.5, and nothing very dramatic really happened. The heavens did not fall. In fact, the economic performance improved. So it's not a one-to-one relationship, but broadly I do expect them to stick to that number, somewhere within, say, 3.3 and 3.5, and nothing very dramatic will happen as a result.
Okay, let me go across to William and two back-to-back questions with you, William. A, the government has been prudent. Yes, it's the fiscal roadmap going ahead that's under consideration, but revenues have been a little under pressure, and many people believe to stick to fiscal consolidation while giving out the SOPs that are widely expected will be handed out. Expenditure and spending will be cut. For an economy like ours, how detrimental is that going to be?
Well, given the size of the fiscal deficits and the debt to GDP ratio, and obviously it reflects the scarcity of resources available to contribute to all the things the economy needs for development. So there's really a trade-off in terms of how much, how the resources that are available relative to what one can spend. That's why things like the GST and plans to broaden the revenue base are important, because that would bring up the resources at the disposal for the government to spend it in ways that would contribute to the economy and to development. Cutting back on CapEx, cutting back on development spending, obviously would take away from growth. It takes away from social welfare schemes. It takes away from capital formation. So that's obviously not what any government wants to do. And obviously those are all things that contribute to both the GDP growth and the betterment of society more broadly. But those things you can have within that envelope of spending. Obviously, there's an opportunity to rationalize and optimize the resources that are available for spending. So things like the direct transfers that would reduce redundancies in the accounts and ultimately basically make spending more efficient are something that the government's trying to achieve. Obviously, previous governments have tried to do these things as well, but this is very important for India with regards to trying to get more money, more impact of the dollars, the rupees that are available for spending. So that's something that we'll continue to monitor, is the effectiveness of those programs, and that's obviously something I think the government's going to focus on through this budget as well, to continue what they've already been trying to do over the last few years.
Okay, give me a minute, William. Before I go across to the rest, I quickly have another question to ask of you. Some of the things that are being spoken about, whether it is minimum income guarantee scheme that has been, referred to by the principal opposition, or whether it's the agri relief package, all of these measures are being spoken of as over and above the SOPs that already exist. Is that a worrying factor for you? Nobody is talking about weaning away and waning the existing structures that are there.
Well, it would be a challenge, because that entails more spending with revenues that are not growing at the same pace. The expectation, obviously, for this year is that indirect revenues in particular may fall short of what had been budgeted. And if you have expenditure that exceeds what's currently budgeted, that would entail larger fiscal deficits. And that's why, during the last question, I was basically one of the main things that could help offset a change in the composition of spending toward greater support to the rural farmer would ultimately be a reorientation potentially of some of the spending that already exists, perhaps in the subsidy envelope or other areas. So without that offset, it would entail greater fiscal deficits, and that would potentially crowd out other spending.
Okay, hold that thought. Anand Nageshwaran, will quickly go to you. One of the focus areas is, of course, agriculture. The other is micro, small enterprises. Now, you are not impressed with what the Congress has done for so many years, like you said. But the reality is that most of these SOPs that are being promised by the political class on either ends of the political spectrum is being done over and above what already exists. And I think Raghuram Rajan was absolutely right when he told us in this interview that he did with us in Davos that the problem in India is that you announce all these grand measures, these big SOPs, without weaning away what already exists. So you've got layers on top, and no political party will have the will or the gumption to wean away what already exists. Is that a point of concern for you? Because this is going to have ramifications on, a higher deficit will not augur well for some of our other macroeconomic stability.
No, I think that's a valid concern, and I think this is what has happened since 2007 farm loan waiver that the Manmohan Singh government announced just before the election cycle heated up in 2008 and 9, and that has become the norm, and every other state has now done it, including BJP-ruled states. And therefore, any other SOP that is announced, you are right, will not be in lieu of the farm loan waivers, but will be on top of that. And I think that's a bit of a shame, because there is no concern for efficacy in terms of these measures. The very fact that farm loan waivers keep coming back in every 2 years shows that the previous one hadn't worked. So with respect to small and medium enterprises, this government did the right thing when they announced the package in October, that they would make it mandatory for listed companies above a certain turnover to compulsorily participate in the Receivables Exchange of India, acknowledge the claim made by the small business and authenticate it so that they could get paid by the banks, participating banks, and then these big companies would pay the banks later. So what is more important is to come up with measures like this, which address the underlying bottleneck, access to working capital, etc., rather than throwing more money at the problem. I mean, if this government, for example, removes tax terrorism and some arbitrary interpretations of what constitutes business income, what constitutes angel investors, share premium, etc., that would go a long way to redress concerns of businesses, small and big, rather than throwing more money at the problem.
Okay, hold that thought right now, and I will go across to Mr. R. Gopalan. And Mr. Gopalan, I think in the last few years, what we've really prided ourselves is macroeconomic stability. The rupee was rather volatile, has come to some sort of a sanity. Inflation is very much under control. For the benefit of our viewers here, I would like you to emphasize on the reason why the deficit needs to be in control, given some of the other factors, given the impact it has on inflation and the impact it has on the currency movement and all of that.
Well, higher deficit means that we'll have to fund the deficit first of all, and that will once again draw out money from the banking system, which otherwise would be taken up by the private sector for its investment and those other issues. 2, this will also increase the consumption. Once it increases the consumption, if the products are not available in the country, obviously you have got to import them. So imports obviously will mean that in the absence of adequate exports to cover the shortfall, obviously the BOP will have a problem, and that will once again with the deficit, the other issue that will come up is it will stoke inflation, because the demand which will push the demand, and therefore that will lead to inflation in the absence of adequate supply, and therefore that will have to be controlled through higher interest rate, and that once again will push down the tendency to invest. And on top of it, with the imports increasing with corresponding improvement in exports, obviously the exchange rate will take a hit. Now, exchange rate taking a hit will also feed through imports items, the cost of the import items into inflation again, and therefore it's a vicious cycle that will keep on occurring. So unless we are able to manage a fiscal deficit in a manner which is consistent with the plan we have laid out, and also look at what is the extent of debt to GDP for the entire government, both center and states, how to keep that under control and put them in a path which is gradually decreasing. Unless we do all those things, obviously we will be stoking up consumption and inflation further, which will have deleterious effects on whole host of the aspects of the macroeconomy. So I think this is almost all the good sense also indicates that we will have to keep fiscal deficit under check, under a particular glide path, and also the debt to GDP also to come under a particular glide path to the extent that we have laid out in the encasing committee report. I think these are all very, very crucial, very, very important.
Okay, give that thought a hold, and I will quickly come back to you. And Maithili, I think the one thing that we speak about fiscal deficit and can't emphasize enough on is the fact that a higher fiscal deficit, bad for inflation, will hurt private investment, and all of that is one part of the story. But the elephant in the room is oil prices. And you believe that, and we've had this chat before, that oil is extremely benign for this government. It went through the roof, for a while, from $80 back to about 60. How do you believe that's going to impact the fiscal math as well? Because that is a tailwind that the government must capitalize a lot on.
Oh yes, this has been a lucky government in that respect. Except for a very brief period, oil prices have been largely benign, and it is because of that they were able to actually reap a windfall, and frankly it is because of that they were able to also spend, because if you see on capital investment, because private investment really hasn't kicked off at all. Private investment, we're slowly seeing signs of it picking up, but the past 5 years growth has essentially been held up by public sector investment, and this has been possible only because of the oil bonanza. Luckily, it seems as if oil prices will again remain soft, and that is going to be a big positive for the government, which it has been able to cash in the past, and hopefully it will be able to cash in future also, whichever government comes into power. It does look as if the only worry on the external front is really on the trade front. As far as oil is concerned, I think any government that comes to power will have that tailwind. So I think by and large the future looks fairly bright for India, except, as I said, on the possibility of the trade war and what it means for us.
Okay, I'll go across to William Foster. And William, I think one of the things that I want to specifically speak to you about is the revenue stream of the government. We keep talking about expenditure being slashed and all of that, but if you look at revenues, the revenue from GST continues to be wobbly. It is not stabilized just yet. It is not the asking rate right now. But the other part of revenue, which should be able to bridge the deficit, is also privatization, is also disinvestment. And in many ways, have you been left wanting of the disinvestment process, and what would your advice and recipe be for the next financial year?
Well, we don't provide advice. We just monitor the impact of policies. But obviously, the government had set disinvestment targets this year that were largely focused on success of the Air India divestment, and obviously there have been challenges around that. So I think that's been a large contributor to the shortfall. And obviously, there are many industries that have significant government ownership, so there is quite a pipeline or many enterprises that could be considered for divestments. So there's plenty of opportunities, but it's up to the government to decide which are the most reasonable to do that, and ultimately to have the most impact on a sustainable basis moving forward. That's why, and those are year-to-year decisions, but we're ultimately more focused on the more durable, predictable revenue streams ultimately, and that really has to do more with direct and indirect taxes, and that's why you mentioned GST. That's very important. This year, obviously, the government had budgeted an increase in GST collections from about 2.6% of GDP last year to 4% this year. So much of the revenue growth was going to be driven in part by that. And that's where there appears to be a shortfall, and that has to do a lot with just changes around the implementation. And obviously, over the past year, we've had changes in some of the rates, and then most recently on the exemption limit for SMEs. So moving forward, that's going to be very important for basically setting a more predictable and durable revenue base for the future.
No, absolutely. And Mr. Gopalan, because you've been there, done that, worked on budgets, we've got these ambitious disinvestment targets, 1 lakh crore rupees. But disinvestment for long now has always been, the ONGC, HPCL kind of a deal, or the Bank of Baroda kind of a merger. Is that what our go-to stake sale can be, or does it have to be a more reliable, robust stake sale program? And how do you go ahead and do something like this? Your advice on budget, sell Suti stake, do what?
Okay, when the stock market was doing well, obviously most of the disinvestment proposals which government had, they should have pushed it ahead. Actually, if they had started the work right in month of April, May, and worked and arrived at what is the list of companies which are going to disinvest or sell stakes, whatever, they should have started the implementation from June, July onwards. Now, the one PSU buying another, like REC being bought by PFC, or Those kind of things are in a sense not the very appropriate way, because then you are depleting REC of the resources, a PFC of resources which it requires, and PFC in any case is having a problem on NPAs, and this amount which they have, they would require to fight against the NPAs they have already have got in the power sector. So, the good thing would have been like a Indian Oil Corporation or a BPCL or those kind of companies, or a Coal India, increase the stake of sale and then get as much money as possible. ETF is one of those good sources in my view for government to disinvest, but unless we are able to really pinpoint the areas or companies which have command a good this thing in the market and which can be sold, and simultaneously revving up the governance system in all these companies. So, these companies look really good, appealing, they appeal to the investors, and those kind of not forcing yourself on the companies to give more dividend or return the money which you already have, so that I am able to manage my fiscal deficit. You keep the money which is required by the PSUs are required for their future programs, allow them to remain as it is, and keep watching them to see whether they are implementing the projects or not. But barring that, I think we should not be creating this kind of uncertainty about what we are going to do, and that also puts off these PSUs from taking investment decisions which are medium to long term issues. So, I think we have to have a stable policy as far as disinvestment is concerned, and just because we have fallen short of disinvestment target, we are going to change it to asking them to return this money or merge one with the other. I think those kind of things are not done. They should follow a proper strategic appraisal of what should be done with the PSUs.
Maithili, do you believe the RBI revenues and the RBI, there's been this interim dividend that has been spoken about. Do you believe that could come handy, a higher dividend payout, transfer of reserves from RBI?
Well, yes, it certainly will come in handy, but it will not bridge the entire gap. So, I do expect a slight slippage, unless of course the government resorts to a lot of smoke and mirrors. That is always a possibility. It's happened in the past. It's a question of the degree of fudging that is done by all governments. Ultimately, the numbers must command some credibility. And regardless of what the fiscal deficit is, Supriya, frankly, it's not just the number. It's also the quality of the fiscal deficit, because last year, even though the government slipped only marginally, the slippage in the revenue deficit was much higher. As against a budget estimate of 1.9, the revenue deficit actually ended up at 2.6. Now, this year the government has said they're not going to come out with any revenue deficit number at all. So, we'll have absolutely no idea about the quality of the fiscal deficit. And that is something that I think we really need to know, because the fiscal deficit per se need not necessarily be bad if it is spent on the right things. But if it is spent on the wrong things, on revenue expenditure, that could be catastrophic. So, I think we need to watch out for that as well.
A quick last word, and I think, a quick last word will be for Anant Nageshwaran. And Anant, when the budget is indeed presented on the 1st of February, is fiscal deficit figure 3.3% or 3.2 for next year, is that going to be the figure that you will most keenly watch out for? I'll ask you that question and then William, and quickly close it.
I think when the budget is announced, I would rather look at the kind of populist schemes that they announce, regardless of whether the slippage is 10 basis points or 20 basis points. Hence, the headline figures will matter. But I would be happy if the headline figure shows a slippage and still they don't announce unproductive populist expenditure measures which have no durable benefits for the beneficiaries and so on. So more than the budget deficit headline, it is the quality of expenditure that I would be focused on. Slippage within some reasonable magnitude will not be a big concern for me.
William, do you agree with that view that the headline number is going to be of far less consequence on the 1st of February? It's going to be the quality of fiscal deficit that you will really focus on?
Well, the quality is very important. I agree with that. And the composition of spending will matter very much. There's ways you can get to a number without it being very credible, and obviously that wouldn't be, that would just signal basically fiscal policy ineffectiveness, despite reaching that deficit number. So what we're really focused on, obviously, and agree, the composition of spending matters very much, but also the commitment to fiscal consolidation, not only this year, but moving forward to the next few years. So we'll be very much interested in what the government has to say about the FRBM targets and the medium-term fiscal consolidation roadmap over the next few years, in addition to what happens this year.
Okay, on that note, completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate. Can't thank this wonderful panel enough to really talk about India's fiscal math, and more than the headline number at 3.3%, I think what will really matter is the quality of the fiscal deficit. How is that being bridged? Is it being bridged by, rolling over subsidies to next year? Is it being bridged by uncanny means of cutting down on expenditure, one that we can't afford when we want to push growth? So many questions will remain to be answered, but fiscal math is going to be the most important part of the budget, especially given the fact that there's a lot of debate on can the government stay fiscally prudent, or will we perhaps see some amount of fiscal profligacy and fiscal slippage going forward. But thank you very much, William Foster and Nageshwar Nargopal, and of course Maithili Busnurmad, for chatting with us on this edition of the India Development Debate.